I was born in Philadelphia, 1928, stayed there till I went through undergraduate school, University of Pennsylvania, then went off to Harvard for a couple of years as in a research fellowship in the graduate school. When I was done with that, went over to MIT, and I've been in Boston ever since, around Boston since about 1950.
Your parents both were Hebrew grammarians and taught Hebrew school?
My father was professionally a Hebrew scholar, and his main work was Hebrew grammar. My mother was a Hebrew teacher. My father sort of ran the Hebrew school system in the city of Philadelphia. My mother taught in it. He taught in Hebrew college later. There's a University of Jewish Studies, Graduate University of Jewish Studies, Dropsy College, which he taught in. But they were all part of what would amounted to a kind of a Hebrew ghetto, Jewish ghetto in Philadelphia, not physical ghettos, so they're scattered around the city, but cultural ghetto.
And was Hebrew the language spoken at home?
No.
Or? No.
Second, well, it was in the background. So, for example, by the time I was, 8 or 9, I would, say, Friday evening, my father and I would read Hebrew literature together and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your perspectives on the world?
Well, those are always very hard questions to answer because it's a combination of influence and resistance, which is difficult to sort out. I mean, undoubtedly, the background shaped the kinds of interests and tendencies and directions that I pursued, but it was independent. I mean, I think more direct influences actually came from other parts of the family.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Please, go ahead.
Well, my parents were immigrants, and they happened to end up in Philadelphia, but my mother from New York and my father from Baltimore. When he came over in 1913, for whatever reason, his family went to Baltimore, and my mother's family from another part of the Pale of Settlement came to New York. And there were two different families. There was the New York family and the Baltimore family, and we were in the middle in Philadelphia. So we naturally went up and back. They're close by. The Baltimore family, families were totally different. The Baltimore family was ultra-Orthodox. In fact, my father told me that they had become more Orthodox when they got here than they even were in the shtetl, the little town in the Ukraine where they came from. Mm-hmm. And in general, there was a tendency among some sectors of immigrants to intensify the cultural tradition as kind of probably as a way of identifying themselves in a strange environment, I suppose. Mm-hmm. So that was that family. The other part of the family, my mother's, was mainly Jewish working class, very radical, very Jewish element had disappeared. They were part of this is the 1930s, so they were part of the ferment of radical activism that was going on in the 30s in all sorts of ways. And of all of them, the one who actually did influence me a great deal was an uncle by marriage, who was an extremely interesting person. He came into the family when I was about 7 or 8 and became a big influence. Married my aunt. He'd grown up in New York, also from an immigrant family, but he'd grown up in a poor area of New York, which, in fact, he himself never went past 4th grade. It was, you were on the streets, and this criminal backgrounds and all sorts of what's going on in the in the lower class, the underclass ghettos in New York. He happened to have a physical deformity, so he was able to get a newsstand under a compensation program that was run in the 1930s for people with disabilities. He had a newsstand on 72nd Street in New York. Lived nearby in a little apartment, and I spent a lot of time there. That newsstand became an intellectual center for emigres from Europe, lots of German and other emigres were coming. And he was a very educated person. Like I said, never went past 4th grade, but maybe the most educated person I've ever met, self-educated. Without going through the whole story, he ended up being a lay analyst on a Riverside Drive apartment in New York. But the newsstand itself was a very lively intellectual center with professors of this and that arguing all night, and working at the newsstand was a lot of fun.
So newspapers and events of the world mixed up with ideas, almost like a coffee house without the coffee, I guess.
Yeah, the newspapers were kind of like an artifact. So, for example, I went for years thinking that there was a newspaper called Nusen The reason is, as people came out of the subway station and raced past the newsstand, they'd say Nusen and what I heard that way, and I gave them 2 tabloids, which I later discovered are the News and the Mirror. And I noticed that as soon as they picked up the News and Mirror, the first thing they opened to was the sports page.
I see.
But so this is an 8-year-old picture of the world, remember? But yeah, there were newspapers there, but that was kind of like the background of the discussions that were going on. And then through him and through other influences, I kind of got myself involved in the ongoing 30s radicalism, and was very much part of a Hebrew-based, Zionist-oriented, this is Palestine, pre-Israel, Palestine-oriented life, and that was a good part of my life. Became a Hebrew teacher myself, a Zionist youth leader, combining it with the radical activism in various ways. Actually, that's the way I got into linguistics.
One of the formative influences, as I understand it, in this period for you is reading George Orwell, and also in terms of events, really, in addition to the Depression, the Spanish Civil War. Tell us a little about that mix.
Came the other way.
Okay.
Orwell's great book, in my opinion, his greatest book, Homage Catalonia, I think it was first published in 1937, but it was suppressed. A couple of hundred copies published, both in England and the United States. It was essentially suppressed. The reason was it was very anti-communist, and in those days that didn't sell. During the Second World War, it was totally suppressed because you couldn't be, it was Uncle Joe, so it didn't sell what he was doing. I think his book finally reached the public. This is from memory, so maybe the dates are wrong, but I think it was around 1947 or 48 with an introduction by Lionel Trilling, and it was presented as a Cold War document at that time. I mean, Orwell, who had died already, would have hated it, but and that's when I found Homage Catalonia. But I'd been interested in the Spanish Civil War long before.
And you actually wrote, your first essay was as a 10-year-old
on the Spanish Civil War.
And what did you say then, and what do you think now about how that event and your response to it influenced you?
Well, the article, like you say, it was 10 years old. I'm sure I would not want to read it today. But I remember what it was about because I remember what struck me at the time. This was right after the fall of Barcelona. The fascist forces had conquered Barcelona, and that was essentially the end of the Spanish Civil War. And the article was about the spread of fascism around Europe. So it started off by talking about Munich and Barcelona and the spread of the Nazi power, fascist power, which was extremely frightening. I mean, just to add a little word of personal background, we happened to be, for most of my childhood, the only Jewish family in a mostly Irish and German Catholic neighborhood, sort of a lower middle class neighborhood, which was very anti-Semitic. And quite pro-Nazi, for all kind of, there's obvious why the Irish would be, they hated the British. Not surprising the Germans were. But I can remember beer parties when Paris fell. And the sense of the threat of this black cloud spreading over Europe was very frightening. I could pick up my mother's attitudes, particularly. She's terrified by it. And it was also in my personal life, because I saw it in the streets. Interesting, for some reason which I do not understand to this day, my brother and I never talked to our parents about it. I don't think they knew that we were living in an anti-Semitic neighborhood. But on the streets, you know, you go out and play ball with the kids or try to walk to the bus or something. It was a constant threat. And it was just the kind of thing you didn't talk to your parents about. You knew for some reason you didn't talk to them. To the day of their death, they didn't know. But there was this combination of the knowing that this cloud was spreading over the world and picking up particularly my mother's attitude. Who was very upset about it. My father too, but more constrained. And knowing from, you know, the uncles and aunts some of the background, and living it in the streets in my own daily life, you know, that made it very real. Anyhow, by the late 30s, I did become quite interested in Spanish anarchism and the Spanish Civil War, where all of this was being fought out at the time. It was right before the World War broke out, but kind of in microcosm what was going on in Spain. And I went to, by the time I was old enough to get on the train by myself, like around 10 or 11, I would go to New York for weekends, stay with my aunts and uncles, and hang around on anarchist bookstores down on around Union Square and Fourth Avenue. You know, there were little bookstores from emigres, really interesting people. You know, to my mind, they looked about 90. They were maybe in their 40s or something. But these people who were very interested in young people, they wanted young people to come along. They spent a lot of attention. Talking to these people was a real education. And out of that, when I wrote the article, it was with that background. It was long before I heard of Orwell.